A farmer spent years unable to work part of his land because of a massive stone. When he finally decided to remove it, the ground beneath was hiding something no one wanted to talk about. Old records were silent, authorities avoided questions, and strangers began showing a disturbing interest in his property. This is a story about a secret buried for decades and a choice that changes everything. The farmer's days began long before sunrise, as they had for most of his adult life. The house was still dark when he pulled on his work clothes, the familiar weight of routine settling over him like a second skin. Outside, the land waited in silence, stretched out under a pale sky that promised another dry, demanding day. Farming had taught him that nothing was abstract here. Every hour mattered, every decision had a cost, and every mistake left a mark that could follow a man for years. The soil did not forgive carelessness, and neither did the seasons. His farm was not large, but it was enough to sustain him and his family, provided he managed it with precision. Fuel prices, weather windows, equipment maintenance, seed quality. These were calculations he ran through his mind constantly, often without realizing it. A single wasted day during planting or harvest could mean the difference between profit and debt. That was why the unused strip of land at the edge of his field bothered him more with each passing year. It was not wide, but it was long, and its absence from production felt like a silent accusation every time he drove past it. At the center of that neglected strip lay the stone. It had always been there, long before he bought the land. A massive boulder, dull gray and rough, rising just enough above the surface to force tractors and plows into awkward detours. The stone did not look remarkable at first glance. It blended into the idea of the countryside, the kind of obstacle farmers learned to work around rather than confront. Still, its position was unforgiving. Any attempt to plow straight through the field ended with metal scraping stone, jolting the machine and the man inside it. Over time, the farmer had learned to steer around it instinctively, leaving behind a narrow ribbon of unworked soil that mocked the neat rows on either side. The ground around the stone told the story of years of compromise. Tire tracks curved sharply near it, pressing the soil into hard ridges. Grass grew thicker and tougher there, fed by neglect rather than the cultivation. The farmer had tried different approaches over the years, adjusting planting patterns, shifting rows, even attempting to work the area by hand. None of it solved the problem. The stone remained unmovable and indifferent, dictating the shape of his field. Neighbors had offered advice when he first arrived. Some said the stone ran deep, anchored by weight no machine could overcome. Others claimed earlier owners had tried and failed to remove it, breaking equipment in the process. The consensus was always the same. It was not worth the effort. Nature had placed it there, and nature, they said, should be respected. For a long time, the farmer agreed. There were enough challenges in farming without inviting new ones. But years passed and circumstances changed. The farmer's plans for the coming season were more ambitious than before. Rising costs meant he needed higher yields to stay ahead. He had invested in upgrades, committed money he did not have to spare, and every calculation brought him back to the same conclusion. He needed more usable land. The strip around the stone, wasted year after year, became harder to justify. It was no longer just an inconvenience, it was lost potential, a permanent inefficiency in a life built on careful balance. One evening, standing at the edge of the field as the sun dipped low, he studied the stone with new eyes. It no longer looked like a natural part of the landscape. Instead, it appeared as a problem that had been tolerated for too long. He walked around it slowly, kicking at the dirt, testing its outline. From the surface, it seemed large, but not impossibly so. He had seen heavier objects moved with the right preparation and patience. The idea that it could be removed no longer felt reckless. It felt necessary. The decision did not come all at once. It formed gradually, reinforced by numbers and necessity. He calculated how much additional land he would gain, how many extra rows he could plant, how that would translate into yield. He checked the condition of his tractor, the strength of his chains, the weather forecast. Dry ground would be essential. Mud would turn the task into a hazard. He marked out an area around the stone, planning where to dig, where the stone might roll once freed. He told himself he was being practical, methodical, not impulsive. The first step was excavation. With shovel and small equipment, he began removing soil from around the base of the stone. At first, the work felt ordinary. Dirt gave way under the blade, piling up beside the hole. But as he dug deeper, the stone revealed more of itself. It extended downward farther than he expected, its sides smooth in places, almost too smooth. The soil around it was dense, packed tighter than the surrounding earth, as though it had settled differently over time. The farmer paused more than once, straightening his back and studying what he had uncovered. The stone sat remarkably level, not tilted or wedged as natural boulders often were. Its base did not taper irregularly, but seemed to rest with deliberate stability. He dismissed the thought as coincidence. Long hours under the sun had a way of planting strange ideas in a tired mind. Still, the unease lingered, faint but persistent. As he continued digging, he noticed something else. Beneath the topsoil, the earth changed. The layers were not as distinct as he expected. Instead of the gradual transitions typical of untouched ground, there were signs of disturbance soil that looked mixed, compacted differently, as if it had been moved and replaced long ago. He had spent enough time working land to recognize when soil had been altered by human hands. The realization unsettled him, but it did not stop him. He told himself that past farming activity, erosion, or simple chance could explain it. What mattered was progress, and progress he was making. By the end of the day, enough of the stone was exposed to attempt the next phase. He stepped back, wiping sweat and dirt from his hands, and measured the situation. The stone no longer felt like an immovable force of nature. It felt like something that could be shifted. Before leaving for the night, he noticed a straight edge beneath the stone, just visible where the earth had fallen away. It was too precise to be a crack in rock, too uniform to be a root or a shadow. He crouched and brushed dirt away with his fingers, revealing a narrow, clean line that ran beneath the stone's base. For a long moment, he simply stared at it. The farmer stood, looking across the field as dusk settled in. The land was quiet, unchanged on the surface, but his perception of it had shifted. The stone was no longer just an obstacle. It was a question. Whatever lay beneath it had been hidden deliberately or had remained unseen for reasons he could not yet understand. He covered the exposed area lightly, more out of habit than strategy, and gathered his tools. As he walked back toward the house, his thoughts returned again and again to that line in the earth. Tomorrow he would bring the tractor. Tomorrow he would pull the stone free and reclaim his field. And whatever the stone had been hiding would finally be revealed. Morning came with a dry wind and a sky washed pale by the rising sun. The farmer woke earlier than usual, his thoughts already fixed on the field before his feet touched the floor. The image of the straight line beneath the stone returned with uncomfortable clarity, sharper than the usual worries about fuel or weather. It was not fear that drove him from the house, but a sense of unfinished work, the kind that refused to let the mind rest. He moved with deliberate care as he prepared the tractor. Every step followed habits built over years, yet each motion felt heavier than usual. He checked the tires, the hitch, the engine, listening closely to familiar sounds as though the machine itself might warn him if something was wrong. The chain lay coiled near the shed, thick links dulled by rust but strong enough for hard pulls. He lifted it, feeling its weight, testing the integrity of each connection. This was not a task to rush. A miscalculation could snap metal or pull the tractor off balance, turning effort into disaster. When he reached the field, the stone waited exactly where he had left it, half exposed and silent. The shallow pit around it had dried overnight, the edges holding firm. He widened the excavation carefully, reinforcing the sides where loose soil threatened to collapse. The goal was not speed but control. He needed space for the stone to move without catching, space for the chain to pull cleanly without slipping. He looped the chain around the stone, threading it beneath the exposed base where possible, tightening it with slow precision. The metal scraped against stone with a sound that echoed faintly across the open land. The farmer stepped back, studying the setup from different angles, adjusting the chain until the tension looked even. Only then did he climb into the tractor. The engine's vibration traveled through the ground as he eased forward, applying pressure gradually. At first, nothing happened. The chain tightened, the links groaning under strain. The tractor's tires dug into the soil, biting for traction. He stopped, adjusted his position, then tried again. The stone resisted, as expected. But on the third attempt, it shifted. The movement was slight, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. A fraction of an inch, enough to loosen the soil clinging to its sides. Earth crumbled into the pit, revealing more of the stone's underside. The farmer cut the engine and climbed down, heart beating faster now. He inspected the edges, widening the excavation where needed, reinforcing weak points. He knew better than to force progress at the cost of safety. When he resumed, the stone moved again, more willingly this time. It slid rather than lifted, gliding along a plane hidden beneath it. The realization sent a chill through him. Stones buried by nature did not move like this. They resisted unevenly, catching and binding as the earth clung to them. This one seemed to release itself, as though it had never truly belonged where it lay. As the stone shifted aside, the truth beneath it emerged. A flat metal surface appeared, dark and mottled with rust. Not a fragment, not debris, but a solid plane with defined edges. The farmer stopped the tractor at once and approached on foot. He brushed away loose dirt, revealing more of the structure. A massive iron hatch lay embedded in the ground, its outlines sharp and deliberate. Bolts ringed its perimeter, thick and corroded but intact. At its center sat a heavy locking mechanism, simple in design but built for endurance. The farmer knelt, running his hand along the metal. The surface was cold despite the sun, its texture rough beneath his fingers. This was not a well cover, not a septic lid, not anything he had encountered in his years of work. There were no markings, no signs of recent access, no pipes or vents leading away. It was sealed, silent, and unmistakably intentional. The position of the stone now made sense. It had not been an obstacle by accident. It had been placed there, chosen for its size and weight, an object no one would question and few would attempt to move. The realization settled over him with unsettling clarity. Someone had wanted this hatch hidden, and they had succeeded for a very long time. He stepped back, surveying the scene as a whole. The stone lay partly clear of the pit now, its chains still taut, the tractor waiting idly. The hatch sat exposed at the bottom, its edges framed by packed earth mixed with gravel. The soil around it differed from the surrounding ground, compacted and layered in a way that suggested deliberate filling rather than natural settlement. Whoever had sealed this place had taken care to erase its presence. The farmer leaned closer, examining the lock. It was not something that could be forced easily. The metal was thick, reinforced at stress points, designed to resist time and pressure. He tested it gently, applying a small tool to gauge resistance. It did not budge. Opening it would require effort, equipment, and careful thought. A sharp awareness of risk settled in. He considered the possibilities. Underground structures carried dangers: gas, unstable air, structural collapse. Beyond physical risk, there was something else, harder to define, but impossible to ignore. If this hatch had been hidden deliberately, then discovering it was not a neutral act. It had implications he could not yet see. He stood, letting the wind pass over the field, trying to steady his thoughts. The land around him looked unchanged, the same rows, the same fences, the same distant tree line. Yet beneath his feet, something existed that did not belong to the quiet logic of farming. It was a reminder that land carried histories deeper than ownership papers and crop yields. He chose not to open the hatch. The decision came not from fear, but from restraint. He knew enough to recognize when caution mattered. He took photographs from several angles, careful to capture the lock, the surrounding soil, the placement of the stone. He marked the location precisely, noting distances to fixed points in the field. Documentation, he told himself, was protection. Evidence mattered. As he worked, his eyes kept lifting toward the road, scanning for movement. No one was there, and yet he felt exposed, as though the act of uncovering the hatch had altered something fundamental. The land no longer felt entirely his. Once satisfied, he shut down the tractor and stepped away. The stone remained displaced, the hatch visible but untouched. He considered covering it again, restoring the illusion, but decided against it. Whatever lay beneath had already surfaced, at least to him. Pretending otherwise would change nothing. By late afternoon, he stood at the edge of the pit, looking down at the sealed metal. Questions pressed in from every direction. Who had built it? When? Why here, beneath a field that now supported crops and routine? And most importantly, what responsibility did its discovery place on him? He knew that ignoring it was not an option. Even if he chose silence, the hatch would remain a liability beneath his land. If something went wrong, if it collapsed or leaked or was discovered by someone else, he would be the one asked to answer for it. Ownership carried burdens as well as rights. As the sun dipped low again, mirroring the previous evening, he made his decision. Before taking any irreversible action, he needed information. Not rumors, not guesses, but facts. Records, maps, histories. If this structure existed, it had left traces somewhere, even if they had been buried as carefully as the hatch itself. He gathered his tools and climbed into the tractor one last time, towing the stone farther from the pit and setting it aside. The field looked different now, scarred by excavation but revealing something long concealed. As he drove back toward the house, the weight of the day settled over him, heavier than any stone. Tomorrow he would begin searching for answers in the only place that could offer them: the past. The next morning carried a different weight. The farmer moved through his house with the same habits as always, but his attention no longer rested on the usual concerns of weather or machinery. The image of the iron hatch sat firmly in his mind, not as a mystery to be admired, but as a problem that demanded resolution. He understood instinctively that time mattered now. The longer he waited, the more control he risked losing over a discovery made on his own land. His first impulse was to handle the situation properly through official channels. He had never been a man to cut corners or invite unnecessary trouble. Ownership to him meant responsibility, and responsibility meant transparency. After breakfast, he gathered the documents related to his land: deeds, boundary maps, purchase agreements, and the thick folder of paperwork accumulated over years of farming. These papers had always felt final, authoritative. Now, as he flipped through them, they seemed incomplete. He spread the documents across the kitchen table and began to study them carefully. The boundaries were clearly marked, the acreage accounted for, the taxes paid without lapse. On the surface, everything was in order. Yet nowhere did he find any reference to underground structures, easements, or restricted zones. There were no annotations that hinted at what lay beneath his field. Given the size and permanence of the hatch, the absence felt unnatural. Large structures left trails, even when people tried to erase them. He drove into town later that morning, carrying copies of his documents with him. The local land office was housed in a low concrete building that had not changed much in decades. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and dust, the quiet broken only by the shuffle of files and muted conversations. The farmer explained his situation carefully, choosing his words with restraint. He asked about records of underground installations, historical restrictions, anything that might explain the structure beneath his land. The response was polite but empty. He was told that no such records existed under his parcel number. The clerk checked digital systems, then older paper files, shaking her head with mild confusion. According to their data, the land had always been agricultural, with no registered constructions beyond surface buildings. When he asked about older records, he was told they would require formal requests, approvals, and time. The tone suggested inconvenience more than curiosity. He left with nothing but assurances and procedural explanations. No one told him to stop asking questions, yet no one seemed eager to help him find answers. The lack of interest felt deliberate, though subtle enough to be dismissed as bureaucracy. Still, the farmer had learned long ago that silence often spoke louder than refusal. Back at the farm, he compared newer maps with older ones he had stored away. Subtle differences began to emerge. On older survey documents, the boundaries of his field appeared slightly shifted, as though adjusted after the fact. Certain markings present in early drafts were missing from later versions. The changes were small, easy to overlook, but consistent. Something had been simplified, smoothed out over time. The deeper he looked, the more unsettled he became. Ownership of the land had changed hands more frequently than he remembered. Several sales occurred within short periods, each transaction recorded cleanly, but without the long-term continuity typical of farmland passed down through families. One owner had held the land for less than 2 years before selling it at a loss. Another had owned it briefly, then disappeared from local records entirely, leaving behind little more than a name on paper. The farmer began assembling a timeline, laying out each ownership change alongside historical events in the region. Patterns emerged slowly, like an image sharpening into focus. There were gaps, years where the land seemed to fall into administrative limbo, neither actively farmed nor officially restricted. It was as if the property had been passed along with something unspoken attached, a burden no one wanted to acknowledge openly. As he worked, he noticed a car parked briefly near the edge of his property. It did not enter the driveway or approach the house, merely lingered for a few minutes before driving away. At first, he dismissed it as coincidence. Rural roads saw their share of passing traffic. But later that day, another vehicle appeared, slowing as it passed the field where the stone had been moved. Again, it did not stop, but the timing felt wrong. The farmer told himself he was imagining connections where none existed. Discoveries had a way of amplifying suspicion. Yet that night, as he reviewed his notes, the feeling returned, stronger this time. The hatch had not simply revealed a structure, it had altered the way others might perceive his land. Whether through rumor or observation, knowledge had a way of spreading quietly. Determined to ground his concerns in facts, he turned to public archives and historical records. Old newspapers, regional planning documents, and property registries offered fragments of context. He learned that decades earlier, during a period of economic uncertainty, certain rural properties had been repurposed quietly for activities unrelated to farming. Some of those activities were later disavowed, their records sealed or reclassified. The explanations were vague, wrapped in language about necessity and discretion. None of the documents named his land directly, but the proximity was close enough to matter. Facilities were referenced without precise locations, described only as temporary or auxiliary. The farmer understood what that meant. Temporary structures often outlived their purpose, and auxiliary sites were convenient precisely because they drew little attention. As the days passed, the atmosphere around the farm subtly changed. Officials returned his calls more slowly. Requests for information were acknowledged but not answered. When he visited the land office again, he was met with polite deflection. There was no hostility, no overt resistance, but a sense of avoidance permeated every interaction. At the same time, practical concerns pressed in. If the hatch represented a hazard, he needed to know. If it contained something dangerous, the risk extended beyond curiosity. His family lived here. Equipment moved across the field daily. The ground above the structure could shift or collapse without warning. Ignoring the issue would be irresponsible, yet pursuing it openly seemed to attract attention he did not fully understand. Late one afternoon, he found tire tracks near the access road that did not belong to his equipment. They were faint, already fading, but distinct enough to notice. He followed them to the edge of the field where they turned back. No damage, no intrusion, just presence. It was enough to confirm what he had begun to suspect. Someone else was aware of the hatch. That realization hardened his resolve. If others knew, then silence would not protect him. It would only leave him unprepared. He began documenting everything more carefully. Dates, times, vehicle descriptions, copies of correspondence. He backed up digital files and stored physical copies in separate locations. These actions were not driven by panic, but by caution. He understood the value of evidence, especially when narratives could be shaped by those with authority. Despite the growing tension, he continued his farm work. Routine became a shield, a way to maintain control in the face of uncertainty. The land still needed tending, animals still needed care. Yet every time he passed the excavated area, his attention returned to the iron hatch, sitting quietly at the bottom of the pit, unchanged and unyielding. He stood there one evening as the light faded, considering his options. The official route had yielded nothing but deflection. Informal inquiries raised more questions than answers, and now subtle signs suggested that others were monitoring the situation. Whatever lay beneath his field was not forgotten. It was merely buried, both physically and administratively. The farmer knew then that the next step would require deeper digging, not in the soil but in history. Somewhere records existed that had not been fully erased. Somewhere names and decisions were written down, even if they were hidden behind layers of bureaucracy and time. If he wanted to understand what he had uncovered, he would have to look beyond surface explanations and polite denials. The past, he realized, was not gone. It was waiting, preserved like the hatch beneath the stone, sealed but intact. And he was no longer willing to pretend it was not there. The decision to search deeper into the past did not feel dramatic when the farmer made it. It felt necessary, almost inevitable, like following a furrow already cut into the soil. The questions raised by the iron hatch refused to fade, and the evasions he encountered only sharpened his sense that answers existed somewhere beyond the reach of routine offices and polite inquiries. If the present offered him nothing, then the past would have to speak. He began with the regional archive, a low, aging building set apart from the main administrative center. It was the kind of place rarely visited unless someone had a reason strong enough to outweigh inconvenience. Inside, the air was cool and heavy with the smell of paper that had aged beyond usefulness, but not beyond relevance. Rows of shelves held bound volumes, maps folded and refolded across decades, and boxes labeled in handwriting that belonged to people long gone. The farmer worked patiently, hour after hour, requesting old cadastral maps, land surveys, and transaction records. At first, the documents revealed nothing more than minor inconsistencies. Boundary lines shifted slightly from one decade to another. Parcel numbers were reassigned, consolidated, then separated again. These changes could have been explained by routine adjustments, yet the frequency of revisions involving his land stood out. Farmland rarely changed hands so often unless something made it undesirable. As he traced the timeline backward, patterns began to emerge. One owner had held the land for generations, farming it steadily until a sudden sale under unclear circumstances. The next owner had acquired it quietly, without the local attention that usually accompanied such transactions. Less than 2 years later, the land changed hands again, sold at a price well below its assessed value. That buyer, too, did not remain long. Records showed no clear reason for the rapid turnover, only dates and signatures stripped of context. The farmer noticed something else that unsettled him. In several instances, documents referenced supplementary files that were no longer present. Notes pointed to annexes, technical assessments, or restrictions that had once existed but were now missing. The absence felt deliberate. Paper rarely vanished by accident, especially paper tied to property and taxation. It was far more likely that someone had removed those records intentionally, confident that no one would look closely decades later. He moved on to historical planning documents, old regional reports that described land use during periods of instability. Here the language shifted. Vague phrases appeared repeatedly, describing temporary facilities, auxiliary installations, and restricted access zones established for operational reasons. Locations were described in general terms, never precisely enough to be traced easily. The farmer read these passages carefully, noting dates that overlapped with the years his land had changed hands most frequently. One particular period stood out. During those years, the region had been subject to heightened activity unrelated to agriculture. Warehousing, logistics, and discrete storage were mentioned repeatedly, always justified as short-term measures. Officially, these operations had ended, their footprints erased as the land returned to civilian use. Unofficially, the record suggested a different story. Temporary did not always mean removed. Sometimes it meant forgotten or intentionally left behind. The farmer began to suspect that the iron hatch was not an isolated structure, but part of a broader pattern. If the land had once hosted something that authorities later preferred to forget, then the absence of documentation was not a failure, but a strategy. The stone placed above the hatch fit perfectly into that logic. It transformed a man-made entrance into a natural inconvenience, something farmers would curse but never question. He followed the trail of previous owners more closely, searching for personal records where official ones failed. Old directories, regional registries, even obituary notices provided fragments of human context. One former owner had left the area abruptly, selling not only the land but his equipment and home within weeks. Another had died under circumstances described briefly and without detail. A third simply vanished from local records, his name never appearing again in association with property or business. These were not dramatic disappearances, not crimes reported in headlines. They were quieter exits, the kind that left no single moment to investigate. Yet together they formed a pattern of withdrawal, as though ownership of the land carried with it a weight that eventually became unbearable. The farmer wondered how much each of them had known and how much they had chosen not to ask. He compared dates meticulously, aligning property transfers with references in planning reports and administrative memoranda. Slowly, a picture took shape. The land had not been valuable because of what it produced on the surface, but because of what it concealed beneath. Once its usefulness ended, it became a liability. Selling it was easier than explaining it. The iron hatch itself offered clues. The farmer studied photographs he had taken, comparing the design to images in technical manuals and historical references. The locking mechanism was simple but robust, built for durability rather than convenience. The bolts were industrial, not improvised, suggesting access by trained hands rather than opportunistic use. This was not the work of a farmer or a casual builder. It belonged to an organized effort, one that expected the structure to remain sealed for a long time. As days turned into a week, the farmer felt the pressure around him intensify. Vehicles still appeared on the road more frequently than before. His inquiries at the archive began to draw attention. A staff member mentioned, almost casually, that some materials were sensitive and not readily available without higher authorization. The word lingered in the air, heavy with implication. He returned home each evening with notes and copies, spreading them across the same kitchen table where he had first noticed gaps in his paperwork. The table became a landscape of dates, names, and lines drawn between events. What disturbed him most was not the possibility of illegal activity in the past, but the realization that its consequences had been quietly transferred to him. Ownership had come with an inheritance no one had disclosed. The farmer considered the practical implications. If the structure beneath his land was indeed an unregistered installation, then its existence alone posed a risk. Liability did not disappear with time. If something happened, if the hatch failed or its contents became an issue, responsibility would fall on the current owner. That responsibility was his. Late one night, he reviewed a final document that tied several threads together. It referenced a site decommissioned without public disclosure, its records reassigned and later removed entirely from accessible archives. The language was careful, legal, and incomplete, but the timing matched the final major ownership shift of his land. Shortly after that decommissioning, the property entered a period of rapid resale, as though no one wanted to remain attached to it for long. The farmer closed the folder and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The pieces aligned with unsettling clarity. The iron hatch was not an accident, not an anomaly. It was the physical remnant of a decision made long before he arrived. A decision to bury rather than dismantle, to forget rather than resolve. Understanding this changed the nature of his dilemma. What he had found was not merely a curiosity, but evidence of avoidance, perhaps even of wrongdoing. Someone somewhere had decided that secrecy was easier than accountability, and now, decades later, that choice had surfaced beneath his field. The farmer knew he was approaching a boundary, not of land but of consequence. Digging further would draw attention from those who preferred the past to remain sealed. Yet stopping now would leave him exposed, holding knowledge without protection or clarity. The hatch beneath the stone was no longer just a relic. It was a test of how far he was willing to go. As he gathered his documents and prepared them for safekeeping, one thought settled firmly in his mind. The land had not been sold cheaply because it was poor or unproductive. It had been sold cheaply because it carried a secret no one wanted to own. And by uncovering that secret, he had stepped into a story that was far from finished. The farmer woke with the sense that the quiet he had known for years was no longer real. It was still there on the surface. The fields lay unchanged. The fences stood where they always had. The morning smelled of dust and grass, but beneath that familiarity ran a current of tension he could not ignore. The work he had done in the archives had clarified the past, but it had also shifted something in the present. He no longer felt alone on his land. The first sign came in the form of routine. A letter arrived requesting verification of farm equipment compliance, something that had never been an issue before. A few days later, another notice followed, this one regarding boundary markers and land use classifications. None of it was openly threatening. Each document was polite, precise, framed as standard procedure. Yet the timing was impossible to dismiss. For years, his farm had attracted little attention. Now inspections and inquiries arrived in steady succession. Officials appeared next. They were professional and restrained. Their questions focused on paperwork rather than soil or machinery. They walked the perimeter of the property, noted measurements, took photographs, and left without explanation. Nothing was cited as a violation, but nothing was closed either. The farmer sensed the intent clearly enough. These visits were not meant to solve problems. They were meant to remind him that his land existed within a system that could exert pressure quietly and indefinitely. He continued working as usual, refusing to allow the disruption to dictate his days. Fields still needed tending, and routine remained his strongest defense. Yet even as he drove the tractor, his awareness stretched outward. He noticed unfamiliar vehicles more often now, parked at a distance or passing slowly along the road. They never stopped, never crossed onto his property, but they returned often enough to feel deliberate. Observation without confrontation. One afternoon, as he repaired a fence near the edge of the field, a man approached him casually, as though by coincidence. He spoke in general terms at first, commenting on the weather, the difficulty of farming in uncertain times. Then the conversation shifted, subtly and without warning, to land values and investment opportunities. The man suggested that some properties carry complications not immediately visible, and that selling early could spare owners unnecessary trouble. The farmer listened without responding. The implication was clear enough. The man knew about the problematic area of the field. Whether he knew about the hatch itself did not matter. He was there to test the farmer's position, to see whether he might be persuaded to walk away quietly. When the farmer showed no interest, the man did not press. He simply nodded, offered a card, and left, as though the exchange had been nothing more than idle talk. That evening, the farmer reviewed everything he had learned so far. The pattern was unmistakable now. He was being encouraged, gently but persistently, to disengage. Sell the land. Stop asking questions. Allow the buried past to remain buried. No one said these things aloud, yet each action pointed in the same direction. What troubled him most was the restraint of it all. There were no threats, no raised voices, no sudden demands. Whoever was behind the pressure understood the value of subtlety. They knew that overt force created records and resistance. Silence, on the other hand, wore people down. It exhausted them with uncertainty. The farmer considered the position he now occupied. He was the legal owner of the land. The hatch lay beneath his field, unregistered and undocumented. If he did nothing, the pressure would likely continue, growing more inconvenient over time. If he acted rashly, he risked becoming the problem rather than the discoverer. The margin for error felt narrow. He began to document everything with greater discipline. Each visit, each letter, each unfamiliar vehicle was recorded with dates and details. He copied documents, stored backups, and placed physical evidence in more than one location. These precautions did not bring comfort, but they brought structure. Structure, he had learned, was often the difference between vulnerability and resilience. At the same time, he felt the weight of isolation pressing in. He avoided discussing the situation with neighbors, unwilling to spread rumors or draw unintended attention. Even within his own household, he chose his words carefully, not because he did not trust those closest to him, but because he understood that knowledge itself could become a burden. The iron hatch remained sealed, untouched since the day he uncovered it. It waited at the bottom of the pit, indifferent to the attention it had drawn. The farmer visited it often, standing at the edge, studying its surface. It represented both the problem and the solution. Opening it could bring clarity, but also escalation. Leaving it closed preserved ambiguity, which favored those who preferred control without accountability. One night, as he reviewed the archival documents again, a realization settled over him. The previous owners had not simply abandoned the land out of fear or inconvenience. They had been given the same choice he now faced: walk away quietly or carry the burden of a truth no one wanted exposed. Each of them, in their own way, had chosen distance over confrontation. The farmer understood their decisions better now. The system that protected the secret did not need to be violent. It relied on patience, on time, on the natural human desire for peace. It allowed people to leave with their lives intact, provided they left the problem behind. But the farmer was no longer certain he could do the same. He had invested too much of himself into the land, not just financially but morally. The idea of selling and letting someone else inherit the same burden felt like an extension of the deception. He would be participating in the same quiet transfer of responsibility that had defined the land's history. As the pressure continued, he began preparing for a final step. He did not yet know whether that step would involve authorities beyond the local level or the careful opening of the hatch itself under controlled conditions. What he did know was that delay would only strengthen the position of those watching him. Indecision was their ally. Standing alone in the field one evening, the farmer felt the weight of the choice before him more clearly than ever. The land beneath his feet was no longer just soil and crops. It was a ledger of decisions made and avoided, a record of how far people were willing to go to escape responsibility. He looked toward the distant road, then back at the pit where the hatch lay hidden from view, but not from consequence. Whatever he chose next would define not only the fate of the secret beneath his land, but the kind of man he would be afterward. The farmer did not sleep much that night. When he did, his rest was shallow and easily broken, as though his mind refused to surrender control even for a few hours. He lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of the house, the distant movement of air outside, the quiet creaks that came with age and settling. These sounds had once been comforting, proof that everything was as it should be. Now they felt fragile, easily disrupted. By morning, he understood with a clarity that surprised him that the period of waiting was over. The pressure that had built around him was not going to dissipate on its own. Silence had become a language, and it was being spoken fluently by everyone who preferred the iron hatch to remain sealed. The longer he delayed, the more the balance would shift against him. Whatever decision he made next had to be deliberate, informed, and final. He began by gathering everything he had collected over the past weeks: documents from the archives, copies of land records, photographs of the hatch and its surroundings, notes detailing dates, vehicles, and visits. He arranged them carefully, grouping related materials together, creating a coherent narrative from fragments that had once seemed disconnected. The process was methodical, almost calming. Order had always been his response to uncertainty, and here it served him well. As he worked, he allowed himself to consider what might lie beneath the hatch without drifting into speculation beyond reason. He did not imagine secret tunnels or hidden worlds. The truth he knew was likely more mundane and therefore more dangerous. An unregistered storage site, a sealed cache of materials that should have been removed but never were. Documents, equipment, or evidence that once served a purpose and later became inconvenient. Things buried not to protect others but to avoid accountability. The farmer understood that whatever was down there did not need to be dramatic to be significant. Even empty space could be meaningful if it proved the existence of something officially denied. The hatch itself was already evidence of intent. Someone had built it. Someone had sealed it. Someone had decided that time and obscurity would be sufficient to erase it. He walked out to the field just after sunrise. The air was cool, the light clean and sharp. From a distance, the land looked unchanged, a patchwork of soil and growth shaped by routine. As he approached the excavated area, the illusion fell away. The pit remained, its edges firm, the hatch resting at the bottom like a closed eye. It had not moved. It did not need to. Its presence alone had altered everything above it. He stood there for a long time, hands resting on his hips, considering the final paths available to him. One option was silence. He could cover the pit, return the stone to its place, and sell the land as others had done before him. The pressure would likely ease. Inspections would fade. Interest would shift elsewhere. He would walk away intact, carrying nothing more than a memory and the knowledge of what lay beneath ground he no longer owned. Another option was confrontation through official channels alone. He could submit his findings formally, insist on investigation, and trust that the system would protect him. Yet everything he had seen suggested otherwise. Local authorities had already demonstrated their reluctance. Files vanished. Questions stalled. Responsibility flowed downward, not upward. If he relied solely on that route, he risked being labeled the problem rather than the witness. The third option was the most difficult, but also the most honest. He could open the hatch under controlled conditions, document everything meticulously, and present the results alongside the historical evidence he had gathered. Not as an accusation, but as a fact. a reality that could no longer be ignored or dismissed as rumor. It would be a step beyond curiosity, beyond patience. It would be a point of no return. The farmer did not decide quickly. He thought of his family, of the life he had built through effort and restraint. He thought of the men who had owned the land before him, each one choosing distance over exposure. He did not judge them harshly. He understood now how that choice could feel like survival. But understanding did not mean agreement. He returned to the house and made preparations. He informed someone he trusted of where he would be and what he intended to do without unnecessary detail. He set up equipment near the pit: lights, tools, safety measures. Everything was recorded, time-stamped, and stored redundantly. He was careful not to damage the lock or force entry recklessly. The goal was not destruction, but clarity. When he finally stood over the hatch with the proper tools in hand, he felt no triumph, only resolve. The lock resisted at first as it had resisted time, but it was not designed to be eternal, only ignored. With steady pressure and patience, the mechanism gave way. The sound it made was dull and final, like the closing of a long chapter, rather than the opening of a dramatic one. The hatch opened. The space beneath was not vast, but it was unmistakably purposeful. Reinforced walls, industrial fixtures, containers marked with codes rather than labels. Dust lay thick, undisturbed for decades. The air was stale but safe, confirming what the farmer already suspected. This was not a place meant for people, but for things that needed to be kept out of sight. He documented everything carefully: the layout, the contents, the construction. Nothing inside contradicted the story he had assembled. If anything, it confirmed it. This was a site abandoned not because it was unimportant, but because removing it would have required explanation. Leaving it behind had been easier. By the time he sealed the hatch again, the sun had climbed higher. The field around him remained quiet. No vehicles appeared. No one arrived to stop him. The absence of interference felt deliberate. Those who watched preferred not to intervene openly. Perhaps they believed the farmer would still choose silence. They were wrong. In the days that followed, he took the path he had prepared for. He presented his findings carefully, not as a complaint, but as documentation. He bypassed local channels where necessary, submitting materials to offices that could not so easily deflect responsibility. He did not speak loudly. He did not accuse. He allowed the evidence to stand on its own. The response was slow, but it came. Questions were asked that could not be brushed aside. Files were reopened. Interest spread beyond the small circle that had hoped to contain it. The farmer felt the pressure shift, not disappear, but redistribute. He was no longer alone with the knowledge. That alone changed everything. His life did not return to what it had been before. It could not. Farming continued, but now it existed alongside a new awareness. The land beneath his feet held more than soil. It held proof that decisions made quietly could surface years later, demanding answers from people who had never agreed to carry them. The pit was eventually addressed, the site secured under official oversight. The stone was not returned to its place. It no longer served a purpose. The field regained its shape, but it did not erase what had happened. The farmer understood that closure was rarely absolute. Truth did not always bring relief. Sometimes it brought responsibility, long delayed and imperfectly assigned. Standing at the edge of his field one evening, he watched the wind move across the rows he could finally cultivate without obstruction. The land was productive again, but it was no longer innocent. Perhaps it never had been. He accepted that without bitterness. The stone, he realized, had never been the problem. It had been the cover, and removing it had not uncovered something new, but something that had always been there, waiting for someone unwilling to look away. The farmer turned back toward his house, carrying the quiet certainty that some truths demanded more than silence, even when silence was easier. The cost had been real, but so had the alternative. And in the end, he knew he would make the same choice again.